This is now episode number 5. We are now moving into yet again more evidence from the 7th century who this person, Muhammad, or this name or this word, Muhammad, came from. We have looked back at the antecedents. We've gone all the way back to 1400 BC to the Ugaritic creation of this name or reference for this name. We've looked at Song of Solomon. We looked at Psalm 68, where in the Bible this name is well known at 1000 BC. We've then moved into more recently into the 7th century itself. We've looked at the coins and we looked at the inscriptions from the 7th century to show that the reference to this character, Muhammad, looks like it could be Jesus. We see that very clearly on the coins and on the inscriptions, with the cross on the coins and also the fish on the coins. No person named Muhammad would be having a cross or a fish unless they were Christians, because that delineates what religion you stand for. And as we know, Islam does not agree with the cross and would never use the fish, because that's the competition. And if it's the competition, you don't support the competition. You are in engagement against the competition. And from the beginning of the end of the 7th century, we see this competition start to enlarge. But it's not a religion yet. It is nothing more than a sectarian group, an anti-Trinitarian sectarian group that was introduced more than likely by Abdul Malik in the late 7th century. A man of his stature, a man of his power and his authority, would then make sense why then this would sway many others to his view. But let's get back to the material from the 7th century. We're still not out of the 7th century. And now what I've asked, and this is Mel's material. He's been putting it together with friends like A.J. Deus and others like Dr. Robert Kerr and others like Murad. They're coming together and then slowly they're unpacking, looking for that missing link to try to find out where this word, this name, or this title, Muhammad, where it comes from, but what it became and why then it become the Muhammad of Islam. The Muhammad, the man, the prophet that every Muslim suggests is the model for mankind, the one who received the Quran, the one who lived in Mecca and then moved to Medina, the one who everybody looks to as their paradigm. Where did that word come from? Well, we don't want to leave the 7th century. We want to stay with the 7th century because that's where this supposedly all took place. And we're going to zero in on Muawiya. Muawiya, who is the caliph from 661 to 680. He was the first Umayyad Caliph. We ended with him at the last episode. We're now going to pick up with him because Mel has found some new material. And it looks like Muawiya is not the Muawiya of Islam, as we've been told. He's, yes, the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, but the Umayyad Caliphate was not Islamic. That's what we're finding. How do we know? Over to you, Mel.
Yeah, so we mentioned the idea that there are crosses on the coins from the 660s, which is exactly the time when Muawiya was ruling. But Muslims will say, well, he was a Muslim, so why would he put crosses on the coins? But was he a Muslim? That's the big question. To find out whether he really was a Muslim or maybe a Christian, we need to actually look at the Maronite Chronicle. So I'm going to just share some slides here. Okay, so big question is Muawiya a Muslim? He's remembered as a caliph, but is he a Muslim or is he a Christian? Well, to help us answer that question, we refer to the Maronite Chronicle, which is from the 660s. Now, what's interesting there, there's an obtuse reference to Mahmud's throne, which requires a little bit of decoding. I used to think that maybe Mahmud's throne refers to the location of where Muhammad lived down in Mecca. But maybe it actually has a different meaning if we take into account that Mahmud refers to Jesus. So let's dig into it a little bit further. So here we have an inscription that refers to Muawiya. Now it's actually written there as Mavia. It's underlined there. That's closer to the Greek form of the name, or perhaps the Syriac form of the name. But what's peculiar is we see again a cross. So we have a cross at the beginning, It refers to him as servant of God and the Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the believers. But there's nothing there that's specifically Islamic. In fact, you could easily argue that it is very much a Christian inscription. And it's also interesting that Muawiya seems to be named after Queen Mavia, a slightly different spelling, but Queen Mavia was a Christian Arab ruler from a few centuries before. So it would make perfect sense for him to be a Christian, but we won't assume that just yet. But we do notice that there is a cross in the inscription. Let's look at the Maronite Chronicle now. So the Maronite Chronicle refers to an event which happened in 660, but it was written in 664. So this is a really good source to use because it's very contemporary. It's only 4 years after the events. So we can be reasonably assured that it's an accurate chronicle of the events it describes. So it says that in 664, many Arabs gathered at Jerusalem and made Muawiya king. And he went up and sat down on Golgotha. He prayed there and went to Gethsemane and went down to the tomb of the Blessed Mary to pray in it. Now, the three parts that I have in bold, what do they all have in common? I would argue that what they have in common is these are three things that you might find a Christian doing. These are not three typical things that a Muslim would do. Why would a Muslim go to where Jesus was crucified? If Muslims don't believe that Jesus was crucified, this is in the Quran, why would a Muslim go there? Why would a Muslim go to pray where in Gethsemane, where Jesus spent his last night, before the crucifixion? Why also would a Muslim go to the tomb of Jesus's mother? It seems peculiar if we assume that Muawiya is a Muslim. I would argue it actually suggests that he is some form of Christian. Do you want to respond to that, Jay, before I go into the rest of it?
No, this would be in a complete contradiction to everything we know about Islam. And if he is a Muslim caliph, he would not be supporting the very things that are at the very center of Christianity, which is Gethsemane, which is Mary, and also the Golgotha, where the crucifixion happened. He would not at all be supporting that and would not be praying there, because if anything, he would be down in Mecca doing it, not in Jerusalem.
Absolutely. So this is the leader who is responsible for all of those crosses that we saw on the coins. So we can see that in practice, what he was doing very Christian things. So this is not just a Muslim who's very tolerant of Christians. This is someone who believes that Jesus was crucified. He also believes that that the mother of Jesus is important to him. So a lot of this ties in very much with the coins and our interpretation of the coins, which is that Mahmed and the cross together are a reference to Jesus. Now, the Chronicle goes on to say that he placed his throne in Damascus. That means, he set up his kingship in Damascus. He might have set up his kingship in Jerusalem, for example, which is where he was crowned. But it says he refused to go to Mahmed's throne. Now, I would argue that this could possibly mean he refused to rule from Jerusalem, Mahmed's throne, and I'll explain why I consider it to be Mahmed's throne. He was made king in Jerusalem, but chose to rule from Damascus. Okay. So, why do I think it's in reference to Jerusalem? So, what is Mahmed's throne? So, if we assume that Mahmed is a messianic word in reference to Jesus, what would Jesus's throne be? Well, first of all, we need to think about the Old Testament. Under the terms of the Old Covenant, the mercy seat was the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So that's featured there in the picture. So the Ark of the Covenant was that box underneath, and the mercy seat is the space directly above it. And that represents the place where the invisible God sat to dispense mercy to his sinful people. If you go to Deuteronomy, you'll see a reference to the request by God for this to be made, and it's specified that these two angels, are placed on either side of this space. So the significance of that was that this was to symbolize God sitting there, dispensing mercy to his people. Okay, so in that sense, it is essentially God's throne. Okay, and it's interesting. We saw a couple of episodes ago that Jews referred to God as Mahmed, the highly praised. So here it fits in very nicely. Now, if we look at Leviticus 16:2, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain, in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die. For I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover." Okay, so for Jews, this mercy seat was where they received atonement from God. Okay, so only the high priest could enter this most holy place and approach the mercy seat, and only once a year to make atonement by God's decree for himself and for the sins of the people. Now, he was the only one allowed in, and they say that the high priest had a rope around his waist, so that if it happened that he happened to die behind the curtains, they could actually drag him back out again. That's how precious and sacred that place was. Now, I would argue that the cross is now the mercy seat, figuratively. Okay, on the cross at Golgotha, Jesus made atonement as the high priest for the sins of many. As it were, he sat on the cross. He's hanging from the cross. It was thus figuratively the mercy seat. The mercy seat is his throne. Therefore, Golgotha is Mahmed's throne. Okay, and further to that, if we look at Matthew's gospel, you can see that above his head they place the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. So there's a reference to Jesus's kingship on the cross. So I think whether people agree with me or not, some might argue, well, actually, the Temple Mount is the mercy seat. That's Mahmed's throne. Others might say, well, no, actually, I think you're right, it's Golgotha. Either way, we can split hairs about is it the Temple Mount or is it Golgotha? Either way, I would argue that in both cases, it's Jerusalem is where Mahmed's throne is. Now, if you go back to the Maronite Chronicle now, having discussed the idea of Mahmed's throne, we can see here that Muawiya placed his throne in Damascus and refused to go to Mahmed's throne. So where is Mahmed's throne? I would argue it's Jerusalem for two reasons. First of all, that's where Golgotha is. That's where Jesus made his atonement for all of us. Okay. Also, if we take it from the point of view of the Jewish interpretation, we could say, well, it's the Temple Mount. That's where the mercy seat was. So either way, we're talking about Jerusalem. It makes perfect sense now because, yes, he went to Jerusalem. Yes, he got crowned, but he didn't settle there. That he refused to remain there. He decided to go back to Damascus, probably where his people are from. That's where his power base was, and he decided to rule from there. So now we've actually explained that Mahmed's throne isn't a reference to the Arabian prophet. It actually, again, just a reference to Jesus again. Now it all makes sense. So we can see that Muawiya is a Christian. He sat down on Golgotha because he believed that's where Jesus was crucified. He also went to Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed the night before he was crucified. He also visited the tomb of Mary, Jesus' mother. We saw that he puts crosses on his coins with the word Mahmed. And he also refused to set up his kingship in Jerusalem because he wanted to set it up in Damascus. Now the whole thing makes sense. That's my take on it. Maybe you can leave your comments below, but I think that makes sense of the whole evidence that we have in front of us. And I think it's clear that the standard Islamic narrative is massively wrong on this whole period. Back to you, Jay.
Well, fascinating. Obviously, this needs to be understood. If it's referring to, in this Maronite Chronicle from 664, reading about what was happening in 660, and it refers to this reference to Muhammad's throne, that would suggest that there is someone named Muhammad who was existing in around 664. I love what you have done here, because you have taken it and saying, obviously, the fact that he stayed in Damascus and he didn't go under to Muhammad's throne, there's no Mecca this early, so that can't be Mecca. It'd have to be somewhere else. You place it in Jerusalem, because this would be the throne that is referring to in the for the atonement that's in the Ark of the Covenant. What's interesting is, whether you agree with this or not, whether it could be also referring to Golgotha or the Temple Mount, both are in Jerusalem. It would suggest also that this was a political decision. Stop and think. If you're already up in Damascus and you are now you're now starting your own empire, the Umayyad Empire, your biggest threat are right to the north, the Byzantines. Why Damascus? Because it's one of the oldest cities in history. It is at the center of all the trade. It is the strongest place for a political entity to exist. That's why Damascus was the seat of the Umayyad Empire. Now, although you are a Christian, and you still see Jerusalem as important, because that's where the Messiah is going to come back to. We've already seen reference that Muhammad is the Messiah earlier in your earlier episodes. It would stand to reason that the throne, Muhammad's throne, would be that central place where the God who comes to earth, that's where he sits, and that's where the Temple Mount was, and that would be Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock now sits today, but that was rebuilt. That was built by Abdul Malik another 40 years later. That would make sense. Either way, whether you agree that it's Golgotha or Mount Moriah, it is Jerusalem. And the fact that he's up in Damascus, and that's where he has his political power, that's where he keeps his throne. The Muhammad he's referring to is Jesus himself, who would have been the one who then takes the place of the mercy seat. Great stuff, interesting stuff. Not everybody's going to agree with you on this one, Mel. Nonetheless, let's put it up there. Let's have your comments below. Let's see what you're going to come up with, because I like to see how people will come back to you on that. Now, you're going to be also then moving into Muhammad in the Quran, I think, is what the next episode. So we're going to move into that next. So just as we continue on, this is number 5. We're going to go on to number 6. We want to continue to follow through this word Muhammad, this reference, or it could be Jesus, it could be Muawiya, it could be many of these characters. Muhammad could be a lot of references to the praised one. I would suggest it is Jesus. We're well into this. It looks very clearly that this Muawiya was a Christian. I would even suggest that Abdul Malik is a Christian. But let's see what we now see in the Quran itself. Let's go back to the scripture itself and see who that Muhammad is. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I think when we look at the use of Muhammad in the Quran and see it in context, we'll see very clearly it fits with Jesus. It also makes clear why there's only 4 references to Muhammad in the Quran, and yet there are dozens of various references to Jesus. It makes more sense that it's actually just another term for Jesus. Why, if Muhammad is so important, would there be only 4 references to him in the Quran, and yet there are dozens of references to Jesus and Moses and others? That has never made sense. We're obviously misinterpreting the Quran, and that's where the standard Islamic narrative is filtering our vision. We're not seeing what's really happening right in front of our eyes, but it's going to become clear in the next episode.
Great stuff. Remember, we're always going back to the evidence that exists in the 7th century, because this is where everything began. This is where everything happened. The Muslims claim that Muhammad, the man, was living in the 7th century, died in 632, and all these references in the 7th century have to refer to him. As we're finding, no, they do not refer to him. And most of the time, they refer to Jesus. Sometimes they refer to other people, but it is not Muhammad, the man from Mecca or Medina down in the Hijaz. Great stuff. Come back again. Meanwhile, this is Jay and Mel, thousands of miles apart. Over and out.